Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Almost 3 weeks after the Sri Lanka Easter bombings took the lives of more than 257 people, tensions seem to have reached a dangerous level in the last 48 hours. With widespread anti-Muslim riots taking over the country, authorities decided to place a temporary social media ban to clamp on the spread of hysteria and misinformation. In today's show, we will discuss the increasing insecurity that Muslims in Sri Lanka are facing. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Jehan Parera, the Executive Director of the Peace Council. He's joining us from Colombo. We're also joined by Mr. Hilmy Ahamed, the Vice President of the Muslim Council of Sri Lanka. He's also joining us from Colombo. Thank you both for joining us. But before we start the discussion, let's take a look at a brief report.
Sri Lanka has been hit by a fresh wave of violence as anti-Muslim riots have erupted in northern province. An angry mob took to the streets to torch dozens of Muslim-owned shops, vandalise homes and mosques. The Sri Lankan government has imposed a nationwide overnight curfew following violence against minority Muslims in the wake of the Easter Sunday bombings. Some social media sites have also been blocked as a precaution. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has appealed to people to remain calm.
The country would be destabilized if racial conflicts are to emerge and the country's peace is to be destroyed. Security forces have been authorized to take stern action against those who obstruct the country's peace. The Premier called on the public to render maximum support to the security forces to ensure peace and security.
Despite all the measures taken by government, one man has died and many others have suffered financial losses.
So now let's begin our discussion. Mr. Jehan Parera, let me begin with you. Tell us the on-ground situation in Sri Lanka right now.
Well, in Colombo itself, the capital, there is peace and it's quite quiet in the town. The schools remain closed because parents are afraid to send their children to the schools. It is outside of Colombo, and in particular in one province, the northwest province, where there are a lot of Catholics as well as Muslims, that the problem has got very aggravated, and where there is curfew has been declared, which is continuing. It was declared yesterday, it's continuing today, and it's very tense in those parts of the country. But in Colombo, it is superficially, it is peaceful, but I'm sure that Muslims are feeling very worried because they are not sure when things can burst out into violence.
And Mr. Jehan, when you're saying that things are very tense outside of Colombo, picture for us, what exactly is happening?
What has happened in some of the town where the incidents were worse is that a lot of people suddenly congregated, came and started attacking Muslim properties, even houses and their shops. And now it is reported that one person has also died. My feeling is that there is some instigation, that there is someone organizing this. And I think that what has happened is that over the last 3 weeks, where the government has not been able to give people a sense of confidence that it is in charge, that it is has dealt with the problem of the suicide bombers, that there will not be any more suicide bombings. It has left a space open for those who are anti-government, who have other ulterior motives of, say, pushing this government out to take action. I think that because this is a plan, this is something that is also planned. Of course, there's also a lot of anger among the people, especially the Christian community, who were the primary targets. But usually one wouldn't have thought, at the beginning, they were kept under control because the head of the Catholic Church made a very special appeal, powerful appeal, that there should be no retaliation. But now that 3 weeks has passed and the situation is still unsettled, I think this is what has enabled those who want to create problems to also push these people in that direction.
Right. And Mr. Jehan, you pointed out a very important point there that even the community leader of the Christian community said that do not retaliate, do not react in a violent manner. And still, after 3 weeks, there is a lot of violence that is being witnessed. Mr. Hilmy, do you agree with Mr. Jehan's analysis there that there is an ulterior motive and this organization of violence, there is someone else behind it?
Most certainly, because you see, vested interests are trying to take advantage of the current situation and settle quite a lot of their scores. And, in the case of the current riots in the northwestern province, it's mostly people from outside those villages who had come and started it. And of course, the village youth obviously joined in and caused a lot of damage.
And both in these cases, the Christians make up approximately 7.6% of the population and the Muslims make up 10% of the population. Both are minorities in this situation. Tell us their dynamic prior to these attacks and what has changed drastically since then.
The Muslims and the Christians, both Catholics and the evangelical Christians, have had absolutely no problem. And in fact, we have been working together on minority issues and have had an excellent rapport. So this came as a total surprise. And, the bombing of the churches proves that, this is not a Sri Lankan agenda, but it's somebody else's call.
Yeah. And describe for us the situation. You told us about the relation between the Muslims and the Christians prior to these bombings, but tell us also the conditions that the Muslims were living before this attack took place, and what was life like that? What was life like for them then?
No, I think, the Muslim community didn't have any reason to be in conflict with the Christian community, because some of the conflicts we face are the same, from extremist groups from other communities. So we have had a lot of joint efforts undertaken to address those issues.
Yeah, but isn't it true that even in March 2018, Muslims in Kandy were under attack, and even then they felt extremely insecure, and the situation was such that then too a social media ban had to be imposed and the government had to intervene to take a hold of the situation. So has this been happening? Has this been happening in the past? Have there been many events in which Muslims have been targeted?
Yeah, this is actually the fifth incident where the government had failed to provide security to the Muslims. The first was in Alutgama, where, it was the same thing, where when curfew was imposed, right, the Muslims were forced to keep indoors. And then, these rioters went on a rampage while the security forces were supposed to maintain law and order. Under emergency rule, not more than 5 people can gather. But here we see hundreds and thousands gathering, and the state has failed to protect the Muslims.
Yeah.
And it is not the first time. This is actually the 5th time that Muslims have been attacked while the curfew was on.
Yeah. And Mr. Jehan, do you agree with that? The Muslim minority has not been protected well in Sri Lanka up till now.
Yes, unfortunately, that is correct. That when the Muslims have been attacked, the police, the military response has been very tardy. It has been very slow in coming, and even after it has come, and when peace or calm has been, guilty are not apprehended, are not taken into custody. But so that has been a very big thing, that there has been a sense of impunity, where these mobs, in the past, they were led by Buddhist groups. Buddhists against the Christians actually makes no sense. And as Hilmy said, it looks very much there for a foreign agenda rather than a local agenda.
Yeah. And Mr. Hilmy, why do you think that is the case, that Muslims are not given the same amount of protection, and there seems to be impunity for those people who are attacking this minority group in Sri Lanka?
I don't think it is state policy, but you see, the absolute majority of the soldiers are from the Sinhala Buddhist community, and they probably feel that they cannot take action against their own, and they also probably are sympathetic to the feelings of rioters.
Yeah. And Mr. Hilmy, it seems that ever since this act took place, there have been measures in order to curb the freedoms of Muslims in Sri Lanka. There was a burqa ban placed. There was a recent message given to the mosque leaders to go through their sermons to make sure that there was no extremism in them. While these measures might be able to be justified on the basis of security, do you think it's a double standard being put in place when not the same measures are being taken against other groups who are perpetuating violence against Muslims?
Well, you see, the face veil has been considered a security threat. And, in fact, our Council of Theologians voluntarily asked people to remove the face veil 4 days before the ban came in. So this was basically theatrics on the part of the government to have imposed the ban, because the religious leadership had already given a fatwa asking them to remove the veil. The recordings of sermons on Fridays, right, is being asked to be sent to the Ministry of Muslim Religious Affairs, and so that records could be maintained to ensure that there's no radicalization.
Yeah.
We must admit that there are some extremist preachers, right, who are not preaching violence, but extremist Islam. So these are things that may be positive to the Muslim community.
Yeah, and hold on to that thought, Mr. Hilmy. We're also joined by Mr. Milinda Rajapaksha, who is a council member from the Sri Lanka People's Front, joining us from Colombo. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Rajapaksha. What Mr. Hilmy was telling us was that the face ban that we heard about coming out of Sri Lanka was actually introduced by the Muslim community leaders before the government announced it. And the government was playing into theatrics. Why do you think that was happening?
I think that we have to understand the context of the situation. There was a heat among the Muslim community and the Sinhala community for quite a long time, which we saw in different modes for last 5 to 6 years. And both times, the community, some a moderate part of the community came together to solve this issue. Politicians had also given due attention to solve this issue. But unfortunately, for last 6 years, this question was not addressed openly. This the religious tension was not taken up as a political issue onto the table. I think that led into many other extremes groups to form their own cults, to form their own extreme ideologies.
Mr. Rajapaksha, on that point, sorry to interrupt, on that point, we'll talk about that more, about the political climate there, but on the point of the burqa ban specifically, that the government announced it after the Muslim religious leaders had given a fatwa amongst their community to stop wearing the veil for security reasons. Why do you think that the government portrayed this in a manner that it was them who was taking this initiative?
That is simply because for the political gain. I mean, because there is a massive pressure from the people on the ground asking government to ban this, and I saw from most of the moderate Muslim people also asked government to ban this for some time, not only after this issue. This issue was on the table for some time, but government didn't take an action for political reasons. But suddenly, when this issue happened, I think the Muslim community also realized, also understood that now they have to come one step forward and take an action on behalf of their community and on behalf of the national security. But then, of course, the government was trying to take the political attention or the political advantage of that.
Yeah. And what new pressures do you think the government is in now that we are hearing about how the situation has escalated in the last 48 hours, where Muslims are feeling more and more under threat? What do you think the government has to do now, and what do you think pressures they are put under now?
Not only Muslim community, yes, large the Muslim community, but the country is going through a serious national security crisis. The simple reason is for last 4 years, government had put national security on the ground, and they didn't take enough necessary actions to treat military intelligence and other intelligence properly. Most of the intelligence units were dismantled. Some of the senior intelligence officials were transferred, and some of the very senior intelligence units who worked on extreme issues were forcefully they were asked to retire. So as a result, today we are in a massive national security issue, and it is not only a national security issue anymore. Now we are in an emergency situation.
But
where,
Mr. Rajapaksha, in this regard, isn't it true that while the country at large is undergoing a crisis, at the present moment, it is the Muslim community that is bearing the greatest brunt of this, because they are the ones who are being attacked the most?
Of course, it is a very well organized crime. It is a very well organized terrorism which is happening at the moment in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is under emergency law. The army tri-forces have been deployed. Police has been deployed. Special task force has been deployed. And government is in place. So how 100, 200 people on motorcycles going from place to place attacking people, and there is curfew also in place. So this looks like properly planned, properly executed, properly well protected terrorism against a selected community, and it's utmost the government's responsibility to manage this situation and handle this situation, and they have given all the necessary equipments and the power to do that.
Who do you think is behind this at this present moment?
This is definitely an organized group. This is definitely an organized team, and it is not day-to-day Sinhala Buddhist people. And I talked to most of the political members of our party coming from these areas. They all said people who came and attacked were not from their area. And so they were mobs coming from different places. When police is there, when army is there, when emergency law is there, how someone come and attack another village? That means there is a serious security lapse. There's a serious political involvement here. There's a serious protection from the people who have power.
Yeah. Mr. Jehan, we're hearing what Mr. Rajapaksha is talking about. He's saying that many troops have been deployed on the ground. There is a tight security situation, and still we are witnessing this mob violence. Do you think there is government protection being extended to those who are perpetuating violence?
I think the government is not totally in charge, and that's our fear, that the government might actually lose control. We're really worried about that. We have, however, a police and a military that have always been obedient to the dictates of the political leaders. And therefore, we are reasonably confident that the army and the police will actually handle the situation. And it is also very significant that today we get news alerts saying that that some persons who have been accused in the past of leading these groups have actually been arrested. They were not arrested all this while, but they were arrested today. I think that the government has not been able to convince the people or even the military that it is speaking in one voice, because the government, there are two parties in the government, the president from one party, the prime minister from another party. They are not in agreement. And my great hope is that the president and prime minister and their two respective parties will unite to face this very terrible threat, which is not only the Muslims who are the main victims at this time, but also endangering the future of our country.
Yeah, and Mr. Jehan, making a strong point there that the government doesn't seem to be united at this point in time, and that is showing. There are cracks in the leadership. Mr. Hilmy, while keeping with this conversation, let's talk about the social media ban that has been imposed all over the country. Can you tell us the types of messages that were being circulated, the misinformation that was being circulated, due to which the government felt that this ban was warranted?
One thing is actually it's the hate messages. But, you know, the ban was more to prevent these mobs grouping together or gathering in different places. Because, you know, last year too, when the social media was the one source which helped them to keep moving from place to place and attacking. So that, you know, so the ban brought in prevented that happening this time too. But, you know, I mean, social media in Sri Lanka has been the cause of most of the hate which happens amongst ethnic groups and communities.
Give us a sense of how many people in Sri Lanka have access to the internet, how widely social media is used there.
You know, it is believed that, you know, it's about 3 million people have access to it. And out of that, you know, the social media users should be about 1.2, 1.3 million people.
Yeah, so that's a significant number of people who have access to social media there. Mr. Rajapaksha, we heard Mr. Hilmy talk about the fact that this ban was more to prevent mobs from gathering, from them being mobilized. With what we were talking about earlier, that this seems to be an organized crime in which there seems to be a degree of impunity given to these mobs, doesn't it seem that this ban in a way contradicts the situation?
I think in one way, at the very beginning of the crisis, social media ban was imminent because a lot of misinformation and the fake news was going around. This incident happened here, that incident happened here, this amount of people died here, that amount of people were arrested there. So there was a lot of misinterpretation, there was a lot of fake news, there was a lot of made up stories going around in social media, which actually made a lot of people panic, and that created an unnecessary issue in Colombo and also in most of the villages. But again, there is another issue here. Now, social media ban should happen when you can't control the situation, which we agree, because there is a lot of hate going around. But if you are to stop the mobs, that is not the way to do that. Because regardless, even yesterday, phone calls were jammed. The general internet was cut off yesterday. Still mobs were going around, you know. That is a security problem larger. If you think that just because of social media, people are getting together and mobbing to attack people, that is, we are absolutely misguided. The social media ban is needed when there is a lot of hate and fake news. But when you also keep people in the dark for a long time, when you not allow people to access information, people also get into more and more anxiety. Then people start questioning your surrounding, people start questioning what is truth or not. People start thinking that there is something much bigger is happening somewhere. That is why government is keeping social media ban. That is also not a good thing to happen. And we all know, even now at this very moment when I am calling to you, I am using VPN. And when I put a post on social media, still 500, 600 shares within 2-3 hours. That means still more than 90% of the people who are who have been using social media are still using social media using VPN.
Yeah.
So social media ban is theoretically good, but practically it is not happening on the ground.
So basically, the ban is not yielding any benefits, none of the benefits that were expected that it would yield at least. Mr. Rajapaksha, on that note, you stated that the phones have been jammed, internet has been, there have been low signals for it, and yet there is so much mob violence on the streets that is being witnessed. Then, and you're saying that that's a security problem. So are all these measures that are being taken on the phone lines and on the internet just optics?
See, now, if you really look at the situation on the ground, if you really look at last 24 hours, now physically, see, if you look at social media, just go and put the hashtag Sri Lanka and see the social media. 99% of people on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram are saying, please don't fight, let's get together, be united, let's respect each other, let's work together, don't make another 1983 Black July, let's learn the lesson from 30 years of war. So if you really look at social media, the atmosphere is actually to bring people together.
Yeah.
If you really look at it. But the crisis is happening on the ground. 100, 200 people are going from place to place, attacking selected shops, and the mosques belong to Muslim people. So issue is there. Not on the social.
Mr. Raja, hold on to that thought while I ask Mr. Jehan here. Do you think that, do you agree with the fact that the social media ban really has no benefits, really has no advantages at this point in time, because the community online is actually demonstrating unity as opposed to hatred and violence, and putting this ban only is going to create more tensions and more anxiety amongst the people?
Well, I think the government, I mean, this government that is in power has been a very liberal government. It has, in fact, even our army commander said that after the end of the war, there has been too much freedom given. You know, we were free to move around without any security checks, and the same applied to our communication with each other. So I think that the government obviously feels that the social media ban is necessary. And what I have been seeing is actually that there is quite a lot. While Milinda is saying that there is also a lot of positive messaging, there's also a lot of hate messaging that I have seen on the social media. And I think that maybe the government is actually thinking that these messages of fear can be spread through the social media. Like, for instance, a good example, which is actually spread by SMS, was the Catholic Church hierarchy sending a message on an SMS, obviously, I believe, fake news, saying that they were deceived, saying that people will come in military uniform. Don't open the door to them. They'll come in army uniform, but they'll come to cut you with swords. And so this creates terror among the people. I mean, it creates suspicion even about people in uniform. So I think it's to stop that type of misinformation from going and creating. And when people are frightened, then it's easier to get them to hate.
Yeah.
So although I'm not here.
Of course, misinformation is something that global is trying to be curbed, and even Sri Lanka's government would want to do the same thing. But that point that you made, that the government feels like it's right, Mr. Hilmy, on that point, do you think that while the government feels that this social media ban is warranted and it's the need of the hour, do you think that the people, the common people of Sri Lanka agree with that?
Well, you know, I mean, it is a fact that, you know, social media was used to mobilize this rioting in a number of instances, and the government shutting down has a great chance of controlling it. And you know, it's not just Facebook, but WhatsApp and other groups. You know, these are groups of racists, right? And once it's blocked, this thing. And you know, I understand. I have no confirmation that, you know, in the northwestern province, they blocked data too yesterday, so that, you know, they had no access to any kind of even social media using VPN, right? I mean, as Mr. Rajapaksha says, they could have used the phone or the text messages, but that doesn't reach many, and it takes a much longer time to communicate these messages, right, to multiple sources. So I think, the social media ban that was imposed by the government was timely and necessary.
Yeah. And it seems like all of our guests are echoing that sentiment that the ban hasn't really done what it was set out to do. Mr. Rajapaksha, what do you think needs to be the way forward? What do you think are the urgent steps the government needs to take now to get a hold of the situation?
We had a 30 years so long war, and we have had so many bomb blasts here and there, even in Colombo. All those times, there was a one coordinated leadership in the government. People knew that, okay, this person is the leader of the government and he's making calls. And that person comes out and make a strong statement saying, this is what we are going to do. This is where we have a strong hold. And these are the necessary steps we are taking. And then there is a proper flow of communication saying, okay, this part is clear, this area is clear, this part is under control. Today, government is not communicating anything. President is saying, acting like he's controlling the government. Prime Minister is behaving like he's controlling the government. Then absolutely cabinet and the other ministers of the parliament are laughing and smiling at each other and, making jokes on press conferences. So people don't trust the government or the authority anymore. That is why when the entire government said schools are open, when the entire 3 force commanders came out and said the schools are open, no parents sent kids to school. That is the best indication in Sri Lanka that people are not trusting the given system in the country. This is a very, very, very dangerous situation. End of the day, people should be able to believe the democratic system you elected and also the executive system which execute those orders. And today that system has failed and people are not respecting that and people are not believing that. So the utmost important thing is the government take the leadership and making the national security the priority and actually show people that things are under control.
Yeah. And Mr. Hilmy, do you agree with all that Mr. Rajapaksha has stated regarding the situation right now and what needs to be done?
Yes, some of it, of course, I certainly agree. But, I do not agree that, the former regime had won this thing because it was a dictatorial voice. Now today, this government was much more liberal and more democratic means were enforced. So obviously, the threats were not seen as they would have done. But you see, the previous government had threats to their own life. The senior people in the government had threats to their own lives from the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. So they enforced strict laws. But since the regime change in 2015, the government relaxed most of it, and unfortunately, I think they relaxed too much. The unfortunate reality is that none of us, the Muslim community or the government, or for that matter, any Sri Lankans, expected such violence from some misguided Muslims.
Right.
I wouldn't even want to call them Muslims because, you see, they are suicide bombers, and anybody committing suicide is not a Muslim.
Yeah. Right. And on that point, Mr. We're going to end this segment here. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Rajapaksha, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Jehan Parera, for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, governments around the world have increasingly become more critical of social media platforms and the role they play during acts of violence and their harmful contributions following deadly attacks, such as the spread of fake news. Several crackdown measures have not only been proposed, but have also been imposed, such as the social media ban in Sri Lanka following the Easter bombings. We take a closer look at the importance of these measures. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Mr. John Stachelski, who is a social media expert joining us from Moscow. We're also joined by Mr. Mathew Bunker, who is a global security expert joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Mathew, let me begin with you. Give us a sense of how crime, violence, and extremism is organized over social media platforms. What are some of the trends that have been witnessed and observed?
Well, the first thing that social media is really used for initially is to, in larger groups, when we look at terrorist organisations, is to really recruit the people to conduct the acts. And the other way that social media is used is once that act is then committed, it's used as the platform to spread that as fear out to everyone else around the globe.
Yeah. And with that organization, how do you think individuals themselves spread their messages of violence? And how do you think they escape the radar of these social media platforms that want to crack down on hate speech?
Look, I actually think that the social media platforms themselves have fairly loose rules when it comes to monitoring these types of events. If you look at the terrorist attack in Christchurch recently, videos of that attack showing the deaths of people, the violent deaths of people, were able to be uploaded and streamed across the globe via Facebook. So it's more the authorities that seem to be clamping down on the social media networks that are allowing these types of acts to be uploaded.
Yeah. And with that, Mr. John, let me ask you, we see in the world of social media that everyone has immense freedom to express their thoughts, and there are various ways to do that, live streaming and several others. Now, with and after Christchurch and several other attacks, how do you think that freedom needs to reconcile with security measures?
Sure. I think that one of the serious problems that we have when talking about these social media sites is that there's this presumption that they're functioning as some kind of neutral network where everyone's just allowed to express themselves, and therefore there's no single ideological trend that goes along with it. But we have to remember that these are massive companies, and they're not beholden to the communities in which they're operating. So in Sri Lanka, perhaps their goals match up with the population in some instances, but ultimately they care about their shareholders. And so those are the people that they're ultimately answering to. And even if they have a local group, those people are beholden to, some person sitting in Silicon Valley that has no connection to the tragedies that are unfolding across the world. So I think that we always need to keep in mind that we can't presume these companies to just be a neutral platform.
Yeah. And with that, more and more politicians and governments want to hold social media platforms accountable for this lapse in judgment or their policies which are triggering violence and allowing violence. Now, what do you think with this pressure after these attacks, especially in Christchurch, do you think that these platforms will bring about meaningful reforms?
I don't think that these platforms will bring about meaningful reform unless they're forced to. And it's an unfortunate thing, but it's impossible to imagine that a company is going to regulate itself, especially when it stands to gain from, if Facebook is hosting instances of this video and it's in the news, people are going to click on that video and they're going to get more ad revenue, and there's no reason for them to actually clamp down. So though I know Facebook said that they had eliminated like 1,500,000 instances of uploads of the video immediately in the aftermath of the attack, but ultimately, groups around the world felt like they hadn't done enough. And I know that the French Muslim Council, for instance, sued them actually for hosting the video, and in a way where children could actually easily access it, and perhaps even by accident, because it was all over the news and being shared on so many sites. So I think that, as you said earlier, that the only way that this has actually been clamped down on is when governments or people that are actually beholden to that local population start making them do so.
Yeah. And Mr. Mathew, do you think that when governments intervene, as Mr. John has stated there very strongly, that it's only when governments would intervene that these platforms would be forced to take action? But do you think there are problems with governments intervening? Now, we've heard of a social media ban in Sri Lanka, and we talked to our guests earlier, and they felt that this ban really had no use except for the fact that the government was projecting an image of being in control. So do you think when the government intervenes like this, it might not always do good?
Look, I think there's really both sides of the argument have validity here. I think when there is a crisis or an incident, a terrorist incident as large as Sri Lanka, or as on show as the attacks in Christchurch were, I think there's reason enough for governments and authorities to step in and stop the streaming of these violent acts, because that's exactly what the terrorists want. The people that commit these crimes, they want to get this out there. And social media is an easy platform to be able to achieve that. So I think, yes, authorities should have the ability to regulate that with social media, but there becomes a fine line where you then overstep that and you start encroaching on people's free right for speech, and just freedom of action.
So who do you think would decide between what that fine line is and when not to step beyond it?
Look, I think we this might sound silly to say, but you elect politicians into those positions. We, as most free countries, elect the politicians. So I suppose you have to have trust in your government, in your elected officials, in your security forces, your police, whether that's domestic or federally, that they are making the right decisions, and they're making a decision that's best for the population at that point in time.
Yeah. And with that point, I'd like to go to a point that Mr. John mentioned earlier, which was that the business models of these social media platforms wouldn't allow them to make meaningful reforms. Now, Mr. John, give us a sense of how in the world this is becoming a threat. The social media platforms' business models is infringing upon people's security and safety.
Yeah, I think we would have to look at, there's several specific instances that we can talk about, and they're actually quite different, but they all have something in common. If we can look at the situation in Sri Lanka, or what happened in Christchurch, or we could actually look at a situation that might seem different on the surface, but is actually related, which would be the situation in Venezuela, where immediately following Juan Guaido's call for a coup, the government imposed a social media crackdown, or allegedly did so. And this, in some ways, allowed them to not have to act in such a way that Juan Guaido would not be able to call out to the broader population to basically overthrow the government. And in this case, I think that we could say that any government on earth would do so. We could criticize this as an act of censorship, but at the same time, China has had a sovereign internet for some time, and Russia recently restructured their internet. So in the case of, this kind of informational warfare, they would be able to sort of lock down and take care of a crisis situation. And regardless of what side we think of this morally, it's something that I think any government on earth is going to do in order to protect itself in a crisis situation.
Yeah, and Mr. It seems that as of these social media sites, at least Facebook, when Mark Zuckerberg wrote an op-ed saying that he wants governments to take control and he wants governments to make Facebook accountable for when there are lapses in their policies. Do you think that was a complete optics as well?
I'm not sure about a complete optic, but I definitely believe that this is part of his advertising himself as a person that's accountable and trying to present himself as someone who's his line is, I'm aware of the problems that my website has, and I'm totally here and ready to listen to all of these complaints and restructure. But in terms of how that is actually going to translate into meaningful action, I'm very doubtful of that.
Yeah. Right. And Mr. Mathew Bunker, just a question to you. What do you think are the future dangers if governments don't intervene and don't take control of the situation? Do you think that in the future, hate speech will just escalate, even though there seems to be in mainstream media this realization that there needs to be better measures taken to counter it and people should be made more aware?
Yes, definitely. I think social media networks, particularly when there's an incident, need to be held more accountable for the information that's being broadcast out there. For the simple reason is that it is exactly what the terrorists want, or the person that committed the violent act. It's exactly what they want. They want what they did out there, and they want it out there fast, and they want it out there for propaganda reasons so they can recruit more people. I think if governments keep doing what they're doing in shutting these social media networks down at those current point in time, my personal view is I think they're actually doing a justice for the community.
Yeah. And on that point, Mr. Yu, I'd like to thank you for joining us and talking to us. Thank you so much, Mr. John, for talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Goodbye and take care.